This is the course overview video. This gives you an idea of the topics we're going to cover over the next few hours in this video. We started off with a discussion of Cisco certifications, where you're at now, where you can go in the future, and the best ways to get there. We'll then move on to talk about LAN technologies. We'll give a LAN overview, kind of a review of the IC&D1 course. And we'll then talk about VLANs and VLAN trunking, and how you can use VTP to either keep your network running healthy or completely destroy it, depending on how careful you are. We'll then talk about spanning tree and how you can manipulate the parameters inside spanning tree to give you a very stable and loop-free network. And then we'll move on to talk about IP routing. We'll talk about subnet masking and how you can take an IP address and a subnet mask and figure out the valid host range for that combination of IP and subnet. We'll then talk about route summarization and how route summarization can keep your routers from being overrun with far too many networks in their routing table. We'll then talk about static, connected, and default routing and how each of those work together to make sure that you can get to your next hop router. And speaking of next hop routers, we'll talk about routing protocols. We'll talk about distance vector routing protocols, and we'll talk about link state routing protocols, the differences between the two protocols and where each of them can be used. We'll then move on to a distance vector routing protocol, or technically an advanced distance vector routing protocol, EIGRP, give an overview of it, show you how to implement it, show you how EIGRP computes its metrics, and finally we'll configure authentication in EIGRP. We'll then move on to a link state routing protocol, which is OSPF. We'll talk about how OSPF does its neighbor selections, and then we'll talk about single area versus multi-area OSPF and how to implement both of them. Then once we have addressed routing protocols, we'll move on to WAN links in general. We'll talk about PPP and how you can do multi-link and authentication with PPP. We'll also talk about frame relay and how you can implement a frame relay network two different ways depending upon how your provider has it presented to you. We'll then cover virtual private networks, at least as far as the IC&D2 course covers VPNs. We'll talk about IPsec VPNs, which are site-to-site or client-to-site. And we'll talk about SSL VPNs, which are basically web VPNs. We'll then move on to talk about access control lists. We'll talk about standard versus extended access control lists and how you can use them to filter out just the traffic you want depending upon where they're placed in the network. We'll then actually have a real live case study in access control lists when we talk about network address translation. We'll talk about static NAT and dynamic NAT, and we'll talk about that special subset of dynamic NAT called dynamic overload or port address translation. And finally, we'll move on to IPv6. We'll talk about IPv6 addresses and how they really aren't as scary as they appear at first blush. And we'll talk about some ways you can transition a network from IPv4 to IPv6. And that concludes our overview of the IC&D2 course.